Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into conflict resolution. And conflict resolution is usually an idea that people hear about in the workplace when you talk about resolving conflict between coworkers and that kind of thing. But with Valentine's Day coming up, I thought it might be fun to talk about what conflict resolution might look like in a relationship, or the most important relationship, which is your partner, the one you're committed to, married to, living together.
You and I both like talking about relationships, so this is a good one for us.
Yes. So there are steps to conflict resolution, and they are probably going to look a little different than what you might think of as the typical workplace conflict resolution. So let's start there with what are the steps to conflict resolution?
So the steps for me, these are just my steps, so I'm working with this with couples every week, sometimes every day with couples. And one of the, you brought up the idea of conflict resolution within the workplace. And one of the big differences is in those two situations is in the workplace, typically there's going to be some sort of power differential. Mm-hmm. And, the conflict resolution, say, between a boss and an employee. Now, where it might happen, where there's similar steps, is if you have coworkers who have some sort of conflict resolution. But even then, there's more of a political, I think you would call it, environment within the workplace. People vying for position and for favor and things like that. So, within a marriage or a committed relationship, I think first and foremost, you have to approach it from the idea of you're on the same team, mm-hmm. and that you are in this together and that you're working together to come up with some sort of resolution. So I'm going to just talk really briefly about the communication piece, and because I know we've done a previous episode on this, but I just want to bring it up again. Listening is going to be the most important skill, period.
Yes.
That's it.
Yep.
And under that, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but there is a conversational technique, I think we call it reflection. And so the idea of you have to listen really well in order to be able to reflect what you're hearing from the other person. And so those two really go together, because I think the other steps of validation and empathy, which we've talked about, you have to be able to reflect what you're hearing. Then the other person knows, okay, they're paying attention. The other person's paying attention. Then when you do the validation and the empathy, it feels more genuine. Mm-hmm. One of the mistakes that a lot of people make by not listening well is that the validation and the empathy, or if I hear this a lot, you say, I get it to the other person. That's really dismissive in a lot of ways. But what it's saying is, I don't really want to listen to you. I want you to listen to me. Mm-hmm. So the reflection is a really good technique. It tends to slow the process down. And then it also, lets the other person know that you're really paying attention. Yes. So that's all we'll talk about as far as that goes. I'm going to give you listeners another idea. And I don't think I've talked about this before. So Gottman, in his research, he's the guy who does the research on successful marriages compared to those that are not. And he has what he calls an appreciation exercise. And I use this a lot with couples. And I wish I could actually figure out some way to convey this list of words. And so he has this whole list, a very long list of qualities that you look at and you might say, oh, I appreciate that about the other person. Now, if the conflict is not that serious, like if you're really, in a strong conflict, you may not be able to do this. But I think if you start off by saying, here's some things that I really appreciate with you, what you're doing is you're setting a whole different tone. And I think that one of the missteps that a lot of couples make is a conflict comes up and they go right into it. And I think we'll get to that, as far as timing, because timing is one of those steps that is really important.
Yeah.
If you have a conflict, you don't need to solve it right now. And often it's really helpful to break or to change the tone from a
Mm-hmm.
conflictual one to, hey, you know what? We have some really positive traits in this relationship, and here are some of the things that I appreciate about you. And so, just briefly, that appreciation exercise is you pick a trait that you appreciate. But the important thing is you actually come up with an example of,
Mm-hmm.
and here's how I know that you have this trait, when you did
Yes.
this last week. And that has a lot of meaning for the other person because, again, it conveys to the person, I'm not just making this up in my head. I've actually thought about it. And, these are things that I appreciate about you. So if you can do that, then I think that's really an important first step. It changes the tone.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the tone of how you go into resolving any type of conflict is really important. And
It's really critical.
I know we've talked about this before, that if you come into this with a position of attack of this is wrong and I don't like this and it needs to stop or it needs to change, then the other person's immediately going to put their defenses up.
That's right.
And you're not going to get very far. Whereas if you come at this from an attitude of, so this is what's going on and this is how I'm feeling about it, then it's likely to be a completely different conversation. So I mean, Curtis and I, we've had our squabbles or we've had things that we've had to work through before as a couple. And thankfully, for the most part, they've always been pretty minor. And maybe this is more of a me thing, but there's definitely been times where he said something or he does something or he's repeatedly doing something that I just don't like or it bothers me. And so, what I'll do is I'll go to him and I'll say, hey, so I understand this isn't what you mean. This isn't what you're trying to do. I know you don't mean it this way, but this is how I feel about it. And he then responds in kind, very naturally with, okay, yeah, I understand how you're feeling, or I understand, and we fix the behavior. And that's worked really well for us. But I think you're right about the timing.
Yeah.
I mean, if he's in the middle of work or if he's really busy, yeah,
Yeah.
or if
Focus
he's,
elsewhere.
yeah.
So, what you brought up, the way you described what you and Curtis are doing is exactly this idea of the listening, the validation, and the empathy. Because what I hear you saying is you're focusing more on the emotional content. This is
Hmm.
how I felt about this. And his response in a simplified way is, okay, I understand how you feel. See, and again, I've said this before when we talked about this communication piece is if you get stuck on the facts, you're going to see the facts differently.
Yep.
But if you say, I felt this way, I felt hurt or I felt angry or whatever it is, and the other person can get to the place where they understand your emotions, you can't argue with that. I mean,
Hmm.
how can I say to you, Liz, you didn't feel hurt? That's not true. People typically don't say that.
No.
And so you just want to go into, okay, tell me, I'd like to know how was this hurtful? So you bring up a really good point about focusing on the emotion and, listening to it.
Hmm.
So a lot of these steps that we're going to go over, as I just thought about it, these are really attitudes that I think you have to cultivate before, because a lot of these things we're talking about are almost pre-steps, getting the right environment, getting the right context in which to have a more productive, dialogue about whatever it is that's
Hmm.
going on. So this is another thing that comes from Gottman's research. It's very clear, and maybe this could be the one takeaway for people today. The fastest way to resolution of any conflict is for each person to accept responsibility for their part in
Hmm.
the argument or disagreement. I realize this is difficult. And one of the reasons that it's difficult that I'll talk a little bit more about is the idea often we think we're right. So
Yep.
we'll put that number on the side. But his research has shown this over and over again. And I see it in the office all the time. In the office, couples come in and there may be some high conflict. If you can get them to settle down and see the appreciation first, and then help them both acknowledge their parts, the whole thing softens. It's just
Yeah.
the environment is totally different. And I think, often what we want is really our partner just to acknowledge that they did this, and they want us to acknowledge, well, we did this.
Hmm.
So I think, biggest obstacle to accepting responsibility, often we think we're right. we have this notion of my way is right. Now, this is kind of an overall marriage thing that you need to work on. Is there are many ways to do different things
Yes.
in life and in marriage. And I think, if you get stuck on mine's the right way, that is the recipe for conflict.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a lot of it too is that we like to be right. We like to think that we're in control. And I think a lot of times when there's conflict, something's happening that's outside of our control. And we don't want to let go of that control when our partner comes to us and says, hey, I don't like the way you're doing this, or I don't like the way this is going, or this isn't working for me. Well, that means that there's something going on that you have to change. And all of a sudden, there's this situation that's not in your control. And as human beings, we don't like that.
We don't like that. Now, here's an interesting thing I've heard people talk about is what do we spend, 12 years? 12 years from kindergarten through, 12th grade for our senior year. And then, many people go on to college. Being right is rewarded.
Yeah. Yep.
And so we have all those years of being rewarded for being right. Now, we don't spend enough time helping people in relationships understand that in relationships, it's not like the answer to a math question or a physics question, but we get stuck in that idea. And so what I've seen, I see this often, is people become entrenched in their whatever they think is right. Mm-hmm. And anytime you're entrenched, then it's going to be really difficult, maybe impossible, to one, either not be defensive or even to be able to listen well, to do the reflection and the validation and the empathy of the other person. And I just want to remind listeners, validation does not necessarily mean you agree with the other person. You just have to get to a place where you can, be able to see it from their perspective. So I really think you've got to give up this idea of being right or wrong.
Yeah, because sometimes there isn't a right or wrong answer. And I think another question that you need to ask yourself with conflict resolution is, does it really matter? Is it worth the battle? So I can think of a good example recently with Curtis and I, and it was over something small. So we have in our room, our light in our bedroom is a fan, and we have remote control, so we can turn the fan off and on with the remote. We're working on getting the number right, and we're going to install a couple more remotes throughout the room for convenience. And we're discussing the number that we need. And for some reason, this came up like right as I was getting ready to go to bed. And he said something about the number that I needed. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't sound right. And in my mind, I'm thinking, no, that's too many. We don't need that many. But then I'm also thinking, is now really a good time to get into this?
Well, so you have one more remote.
Exactly. I mean, for one, does it matter if we have an extra remote? And for two, do I really want to have this discussion right now when I'm really tired and want to go to bed? And I thought, no, I'm just going to pencil this in, and we're going to talk about this at a different time. And it was a couple of days later, and I brought it back up, and he explained what he meant by, oh, no, this is why we need the other remote. And I said, oh, okay, that makes sense. And that was the end of it. Maybe not even really a conflict, just a discussion. And so, don't do it when you're tired. That's probably
right. So you're bringing up a really good point. And again, this is almost like a pre-step. Pick the time, choose the time. Yeah. And I really agree. Don't do it late at night. Yeah. Nothing's going to be gained. You're both tired, or maybe one of you is tired. You're ready to go to bed. That is not the time to start engaging in some conversation where you really have to be listening well to the other person and have validation and empathy. We have limited emotional resources. We aren't.
Yes.
It's not like it's unlimited. And so pick the time. Don't do it late at night. I think something that goes along with that is the idea of setting an appointment. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people resist this, which I don't really understand it. Although there are certainly some people, I think it's more anxious people, have that idea of, I've got to solve this right now. This is bothering me. I need to solve it right now. Now, I think the great thing about setting an appointment is you both become ready. Like, I would like to talk about this. When would be a good time? So it's respectful. Mm-hmm. And, you can come up with a time. Now, the anxious person, over time, I think they can learn to be less anxious, at least about this, because if you then follow through, let's say we set a time tonight at 8:00, we're going to sit down and have this discussion. Mm-hmm. And if at 8:00, both of you are really aware and say, okay, it's 8 o'clock, we're going to do this. What you end up doing is you build trust. You build trust that we can actually set an appointment and we'll come to it and we'll talk about it. Because I think the anxiety, the fear is we are never going to solve this. We're never
Yeah.
going to adequately get this taken care of. And so they don't want to let the other person go. Another piece that goes along with this is I really believe in time limited discussions. You've got to have some idea of how long this is going to go on before you take a break, because I do hear this very often. One person, and again, I think it ties into anxiety. One person just wants to keep going, and it's almost like they're spinning.
Yeah.
And they can't stop spinning. And the other person is doing their best job to really say, okay, I get it, I understand. But still, it's hard for the other person to come off of it. And so I think you have to agree, let's go a half hour, let's go 45 minutes. I think any longer than that, you get worn out. And those emotional resources that you really need to be effective get depleted. So I think choose your time or set a time, set an appointment, and then maybe you need to agree. We'll talk about this, and if we don't have a resolution, it's okay. We will put it on hold, and hopefully you've built up that trust that says we will come back. And I think I've said this before. Do not say we will talk about this later. It's too ambiguous. Say, we will talk about this tomorrow at 10 o'clock or something, or we will talk about this tomorrow after breakfast or after dinner. So set a very specific time that you can grab onto. If you say we'll do it later, later never comes. It's always later.
Yeah. I mean, well, later, my kids hate it when I say maybe later.
Yeah, because you've just said, I don't know.
I basically said no. I mean, I should just own that I'm saying no. But anyways, so I think another good tool for conflict resolution should be, a temperature gauge or a temperature check. Check the temperature of the room between yourselves. If things are starting to get too hot, take 15 minutes and stop. If
take a time out. Yeah.
Yes.
But again, with timeouts, and I think we've gone over this in previous episodes, it's really important to set a very specific time to come back. Yeah. Let's take a break for 15 minutes or a half hour. And again, a lot of the anxious people typically don't like to do that because their history with their partner is probably one where they don't come back to talk about it, and it just gets left. That's not good for the person with that anxiety, but it's also not good for the relationship. Because I do hear a lot of couples come in and say, we never get to a resolution or, some sort of agreement. And so I think that you're exactly right. If either one of you starts to flood, which is the equivalent of taking the temperature, take a break, but set a very specific time to come back. Now, the other thing in that break, you've both got to go do something to calm down.
Yes.
Don't just go off and spin more about how you're right, because you're going to come back and it's not going to be good.
Yeah, don't go off and brood and think about it. No. You got to take a mental break from it too. Do something to take your mind off of it and try to come back at it, with a fresh perspective.
Yes. So, you have to be able to quit using the words like always and never. One of the things that doesn't work is they're almost never true.
Yes.
I've seen this so often. If the person says you always do XYZ, what happens in the person who's being accused of that, they then shift to, well, wait, here are the times that I don't do that. So that you've lost the thread of the discussion and you've gone on, you've shifted more to facts. Well, I don't do it this time, or I didn't do it that time. Yep. Instead of talking about, you could change those words, never and always. We call them absolute words. Don't use absolute words. And so you can change always to, what I've noticed that you often do something.
Yeah.
And when it's softer, it's probably more accurate. It's really hard to disagree with, usually. Yep. What you want to do in conflict resolution is you want to decrease the likelihood that you're going to make the other person defensive. That defensiveness that you brought up earlier. And one of the ways to do that, well, all those steps that we've talked about, but also not using absolute words. It's really easy to use those, and you've got to learn to catch yourself and replace the word with something that's more accurate.
Or rather than just pointing the finger and saying, you always do this, say, when you do this, it makes
It
me
makes me
feel this. And
excellent.
yeah,
Yes.
and so, make it about the emotion of the way it makes you feel, because you can't be wrong about your own emotions. And
You're
someone
starting
can
to sound like me, Liz, which is, I agree with you. But it is, maybe you and Curtis do that well. It's really tough to get couples to shift from fact-based to emotion-based, which is what we're talking about.
maybe, I don't know, maybe we're just easygoing people. I think that has a lot to do with it.
So the more steps, when you're actually engaged in the conversation, I have seen this in my office and I have to step in where one person keeps going. And
Mm-hmm.
there's this old idea. We used this years ago when we worked at the Family Support Center called the talking stick.
Yes.
And I actually made this very cool stick. We were working with kids at the time. And, so to pass in this group setting and to pass around the stick, and whoever has the stick is the one that gets to talk. And
Mm-hmm.
also it's the focus of, I'm going to listen to you. So if you, sometimes I think couples could probably benefit from having the same type of device.
Yeah.
One, it's a cue, it's a visual cue that says, I am listening to you,
Mm-hmm.
but you also have to be willing to give up a talking stick at
Yeah.
times. It's hard to
Yes.
put a timer on it. I don't know how
Yeah.
we do that. But, we're adults here. We can really self-regulate, hopefully, and realize, okay, I've been talking for a while and it's important that the other person has a chance. Here are a couple of other, I think you could call them steps or just techniques. I hear this in the office, and I know people do it at home, where they bring in allies. So they're saying,
Mm.
well, you know what, your family thinks the same thing. Or I've heard your friends talk about this and they're saying the exact same thing. That is a
Nope.
huge mistake.
Yes.
You've got to keep it between the two of you, period. It's the
Mm-hmm.
two of you only.
Yes.
That's what you're talking about. Do not bring in allies. The other thing that I often see couples do right in my office is, and I see it as almost this branch, and they'll branch off and they'll start bringing in other subjects. And if you don't control that, 15 minutes down the road, who knows where you are,
Yep.
in because they've lost the thread of the original topic or the original issue. And you really want to train yourself. I think it's just training and paying attention. If you bring up a subject, subject X, stay on that. Do not
Mm-hmm.
divert. Now, it doesn't mean that the other subjects are not important. It just means you're going to have a different conversation about that at a different time. And so stay focused on what it
Yes.
is you're talking about. Because in the end, I think I talked about this with those steps of listen, validate, empathy. There's actually the fourth step, which I don't talk about that often. The fourth step is resolution, or
Mm-hmm.
having some sort of, solution. Because I certainly hear this often, that one of the problems with conflict resolution is the resolution piece doesn't happen.
Yep.
And they're really good at the conflict part, and
Uh-huh.
they aren't very good at coming up with what's the solution or the resolution. But I really believe this, and I've seen it so many times. You have to do those first steps, all the things we talked about: listen, the validation, the empathy, focusing on the emotion, not using those absolute words, pick your timing. And once you do that for each other, where you're really getting the other person's emotional experience, then one of you says, what should we do about this? Or what's the solution to this?
Mm-hmm.
And what you're doing, all these things we've talked about before, is you're setting the stage for a more effective conversation
Yeah.
about what the solution is, which is where you want to get to. A mistake that so many couples make is they go right to solution, and they're being defensive, and they're back to, I'm right, you're wrong, and they aren't listening to each other, and they're probably tired. And so a lot of this, I'd say, I call it process, or it's procedural. you really have to think about what your process is. I think conflict resolution in couples is mostly about setting the correct process or the right process that increases the likelihood that you're going to get to that resolution or solution stage and have a really productive conversation. And people don't. All the things that we've talked to, the steps, that's what it's really about. I'm convinced that most couples, I see this, even though their process might not be very good, is they really love each other and they really care about each other.
Yeah.
They're just having trouble conveying that and they don't set the context of the discussion or the argument in the right way so that they increase the likelihood of a good outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you said it perfectly at the beginning. You need to remember that you're on the same team.
Yes.
Ultimately, you're working towards the same goals. And, we talked about timing and, picking when to have your battles. You also have to think, is the battle really worth it? And I think sometimes it's important to ask yourself, 10 years down the road, how much is this going to matter?
And here's the key for me when I ask couples, they'll come in and they'll say, well, we had this really big, they'll describe it as we had this really big argument. And my next question is, if we're going to go into it, I say, well, what was the argument about? Do you know how many times people go, I have no idea? That is a clue that says whatever it was you were talking about was not that important.
Or that it was really about something else.
Or it was about something else, yeah, which we do talk about that as well. But still, most people, it's about their process. And what they're really upset about is their process, not necessarily whatever the issue was, because 3 days later they have no idea what that issue is. Another important thing I forgot to mention: don't bring up the past.
Yes.
Right? Bringing up the past, I mean, it's kind of in that same category as bringing up allies. So and so says this about you, and in the past you did this. They are just not good tools to have to talk about a current conflict or to come up with a solution, because what that does, we go back to defensiveness. If one or both of you are defensive, it kills the process.
Yep.
It just kills it. And so maybe the takeaway should be work on not being defensive, because if you cannot be defensive, you've just increased the likelihood you'll have a positive outcome.
Yeah. And, being defensive can go both ways. I think, that's why it's so important when you want something to change in your relationship, big or small, you need to come at it from an attitude of, I would like things to be different, not you need to do this, you need to change this. I think your attitude going in makes all the difference. So, I mean, if you can learn not to be defensive, but also learn how to approach it, you've got to approach things the right way. I mean, because the approach is everything.
The approach is everything. It's that what I call process. And I think we mentioned this, but I'm going to mention it again, that if you go into it with the attitude of a we, instead of a you and an I, like you could even say, I would really like it if we could do this. And, whatever this is, I would really like it if we could approach our conflicts in a different way. Then, it's not about you. And so when, if you can approach it from a we perspective, again, what you're doing is you're decreasing the defensiveness or the likelihood that one or both of you will be defensive.
So I'm going to give a book recommendation for a change.
Oh, good.
Yes. So this is a book that I recently listened to. And Mark, I've told you about this book before, and I know you don't agree with the title, but I thought it was a worthwhile book. It's called Everybody Fights by Kim and Penn Holderness. And they're an internet personality. And the subtitle is, So Why Not Get Better at It? And I know...
Well, I like that idea. I just wouldn't use the word fight. That's all. I just have an issue with that word.
Right. So, I mean, but it's this couple who they've been together for a number of years, and they do like these really cheesy, funny parody songs on the internet. But, I mean, they've sure made a go of it. I mean, a lot of people know who the Holderness family is. And anyways, and so they talk about a lot of really good things in this book about what they've learned from their fights, as they call it. And they focus on a lot of the things that we've touched on here, in that you've got to listen to what the other person is saying. And so I enjoyed the book, and I think it's worthwhile, if nothing, just to learn how to learn from your mistakes, learn how to learn from these arguments, or if something gets so big and so out of hand, learn from it.
I agree. So I'm glad you brought the book up. Effective problem solving takes time and practice.
Yes.
It requires learning. I agree with you 100%, Liz. It requires learning from your mistakes. I just have a problem with the word fight, because there's a whole different connotation to that. I would say every couple, and I really think this is true, has disagreements.
Yes.
Every couple has disagreements. So why not learn to do a better job of resolving those disagreements? You cannot be married. I just can't imagine being married. You bring two people together. Why would you not have disagreements? Of course you're going to have disagreements. So, plan to do a better job at resolving the disagreements.
Yeah. I mean, if you walk into a marriage knowing that you're not going to get along all the time, then, your marriage is going to go a whole lot smoother. I think people think that, once they get married, they're going to be in love and they're going to be so happy that there's never going to be any problems. Well, let me tell you, that's Disneyland.
Well, actually, that's a good point. It's the Disney movies where the birds are flying all around and they come and light on your shoulder.
Happily ever after.
After.
You're thinking about a Disney movie.
The Snow White and the Prince, you don't see 2 years on when they're arguing about, who left the bathroom light on and they need to turn it off. Squeezing the toothpaste the wrong way. So we have this romantic notion that if we love each other, that it's all happily ever after. Now it is happily ever after, I think, but there are bumps along the road. And I really think the bumps are, they're not a bad thing, because I think we learn and we grow as individuals and as a couple if we effectively go through those bumps and have the resolution and solution. That is not a bad thing. I just thought of this. The other thing is, it's not bad to let your kids see you having good and effective conflict resolution.
Yes.
And because it's a good skill. I hear all the time, I didn't see my parents do this, and so they don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
So, if you have a really good process and it's calm and it's respectful and you're really listening to the other person, that's not a bad thing to let your kids see sometimes.
Yeah. And I don't think that we can ever go through life without our kids sometimes seeing the maybe not so good conflict resolutions that happen.
Yeah, because we aren't perfect.
Yeah. And
You're right.
But I promise you, it's not going to ruin your child.
It will not. This is real life. But, you don't want to let them see you screaming and yelling and calling names. We haven't mentioned those steps because I hope they're pretty obvious, that you don't scream and yell at the other person or call names. I mean, that's kind of basic. You shouldn't be doing that ever.
At all. Yeah.
Ever to anyone. I mean, why would we treat any other person that way, let alone our partner?
If you get to that point, not only did you forget to check the temperature, your thermometer is broken.
Or check your own temperature,
Yeah. You missed a really key step there.
Yes.
Yeah.
The listeners can do this. You just have to be really mindful about it and take some of these steps. I think it's setting the context before you actually engage in the conversation that increases the likelihood of a positive outcome.
Yes. And you, the engager, if you're the one that wants to engage in the conflict resolution, if you're the one that has the problem, you need to take accountability and set the tone.
I like that. Yes. I agree.
All right. So next week, we're going to get into a completely different topic, but it's going to be a good one. We're going to talk about sociopaths. Something
serious, more serious.
Yeah, serious. So sociopaths, we're going to get into that. That'll be an interesting listen. All right. Have a good week, everyone.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.